There are films you remember for the monsters and films you remember for the atmosphere. Invasion of the Body Snatchers is all atmosphere. I first encountered films like this when they were already old films. They turn up on television, often late at night, and the fact that they were in black and white somehow made them feel as though they belonged to another world. You knew you were watching something made 20 years earlier, but that didn't make it feel safely distant. If anything, it made it stranger. Don Siegel's Invasion of the Body Snatchers, released in 1956, begins with a wonderfully unsettling idea. People in a small California town are discovering that their friends and relatives aren't quite themselves anymore. They look exactly the same, they remember everything they should remember, but the person they knew has somehow gone. And if you've seen the film, you'll know that the great trick is that Siegel doesn't rush to show us what has happened. For quite a while, we're in the same position as Kevin McCarthy's Dr. Miles Bennell. Something is clearly wrong, but nobody can quite explain what it is. Then come the pods. Those peculiar fleshy things lying on beds and appearing in spare rooms, waiting to produce a perfect duplicate of somebody. They're a wonderfully memorable piece of 1950s science fiction imagery. But the pods themselves aren't really the frightening part. The frightening part is what happens afterwards. Because the duplicate has your face, it has your memories, it knows your friends and family. It just doesn't care about any of them. That was Jack Finney's idea in his 1954 novel The Body Snatchers, and it's what makes the story much more interesting than a straightforward alien invasion picture. It's about identity, it's about conformity, it's about the possibility that everyone around you could change while you remain the only person who notices. 22 years later, Philip Kaufman would make the story again. Same basic nightmare, very different America. When he wrote the novel, Finney wasn't particularly interested in giving us an elaborate explanation of where the creatures come from. There are no great battles with alien armies and very little of the usual science fiction machinery. Instead, he took on something thoroughly ordinary, an American town and the people who live in it, and introduced one horrible possibility. What if the person you knew best wasn't really that person anymore? The first clues are almost embarrassingly mundane. People become convinced that their relatives have changed. They haven't grown horns or started speaking in an alien language. They still look perfectly normal. It's just that their behaviour has become subtly, inexplicably wrong. And that makes the Doctor at the centre of the story particularly useful. Miles Bennell has every reason to look for an ordinary explanation. If patients arrive claiming that their husbands or wives have somehow been replaced, the sensible response isn't to start looking for extraterrestrials, at least not at first. Finney lets the suspicion build gradually, and that was one of the things Don Siegel understood when he brought the story to the screen. The invasion doesn't announce itself, it sneaks into the spare bedroom. It appears on a kitchen table. It lies quietly on a bed while somebody sleeps. And then you discover what it's making. The idea of a duplicate wasn't particularly new in science fiction. Stories about doubles and imposters go back a long way. What makes the Body Snatchers different is the intimacy of the replacement. The alien doesn't simply want to kill you, it wants to be you. And once it has succeeded, your friends and family are still there, apparently carrying on exactly as before. They know your name. They know the little things about you. They can have exactly the same conversations. But the emotional connection has disappeared. That's a much nastier idea than a flying saucer landing in the garden. A flying saucer gives you something to point at. The body snatcher can sit at your breakfast table. By the time Siegel made the film 2 years later, the ingredients were already there. What he added was a visual style and an atmosphere that turned Finney's rather strange premise into something you could actually see happening. And one of the cleverest things about the film is that for quite a while, Sansamira doesn't look like a science fiction setting at all. It looks like somewhere people actually live, which is precisely why you start to feel uneasy when it stops looking quite right. Siegel was an interesting choice to make the film because he wasn't coming from a world of prestige science fiction. He was a director who understood pace, tension, and economy, and Invasion of the Body Snatchers benefits from all three. There's very little wasted movement in it. Miles Bennell comes back to Santa Mira and finds himself confronted with a series of apparently ordinary people making an apparently impossible complaint. Their relatives look the same, but somehow they're not the same people. McCarthy plays Miles as a man who is trying very hard to remain rational. He isn't the sort of movie doctor who takes one look at a strange object and immediately announces that Martians have landed. He keeps looking for an explanation that makes sense. That makes his gradual change from skepticism to terror much more convincing. And Siegel is careful about what he shows us. The film spends a surprising amount of time simply watching people talk. A consultation in the doctor's office, a conversation in somebody's home, people sitting around discussing what might be happening. On paper, that doesn't sound like much of a science fiction thriller. On screen, it becomes increasingly uncomfortable because we're waiting for somebody to say the thing that Miles doesn't want to hear. And then Siegel gives us the pods. I love the way they're introduced because they aren't presented like some spectacular piece of alien technology. They're just there. A strange, organic looking object lying where it shouldn't be. Ordinary domestic spaces suddenly become threatening. A bed isn't necessarily somewhere you go to sleep anymore. It might be where your replacement is waiting for you. That's one of the greatest strengths of the black and white photography. Santa Mira looks completely ordinary. There are no elaborate futuristic sets to tell us that we're in a science fiction film. There are streets, houses, bedrooms, cars, and doctors' surgeries. It's recognizable America. And because it looks so ordinary, the increasingly strange behaviour of the people becomes much more disturbing. McCarthy is particularly good once Miles realises what's happening. His performance becomes increasingly physical. He runs, he sweats, he shouts, he looks exhausted. By the final stages, he's not behaving like the calm doctor we met at the beginning because the situation has stripped that calmness away. Dana Winter plays Becky. Their relationship gives the film something it desperately needs. Without it, the story could become an exercise in paranoia. With Becky beside him, Miles has somebody he desperately wants to save, which makes the central horror much more personal. It's not simply that Santa Mira is being invaded. It's that Miles is watching the people he knows disappear while their faces remain behind. And by the time he understands what the pods are doing, the film has already achieved something pretty clever. We don't need to be frightened of the aliens. We're frightened of going to sleep. It's almost impossible to watch Invasion of the Body Snatchers now without asking what the pods are supposed to represent. In 1956, there was certainly no shortage of possible answers. America was in the middle of the Cold War. The fear of communism was everywhere, and the anti-communist hysteria of the McCarthy years had encouraged people to look at one another with suspicion. At the same time, post-war America was becoming increasingly prosperous and increasingly suburban. A world in which fitting in and getting on with things could sometimes seem more important than being different. So it's easy to see the pod people as an image of conformity. They all look alike, they all behave alike, they don't argue, they don't get jealous, they don't fall in love, and they don't seem particularly bothered by anything. In fact, when Miles tries to explain what's happening, the pod people don't sound like fanatics at all. They sound reasonable. This makes the film's politics much more interesting than the simple idea that the pod people are communists. The pods offer a bargain. Give up the difficult bits of being human, and you can have a quiet life. No heartbreak, no arguments, no loneliness, no disappointment. Just a nice, orderly existence in which everybody understands everybody else, because everybody is essentially the same. That's a pretty unsettling proposition in a film made at a time when American culture was placing an enormous value on conformity. But Don Siegel himself resisted the idea that he deliberately made a political allegory. He was interested in the loss of emotion and individuality. And the political interpretations came partly from the circumstances in which the film was released. That's worth remembering because films can acquire meanings that their makers didn't necessarily put there. An Invasion of the Body Snatchers is a particularly good example. You can see McCarthyism in it. You can see the fear of communism. You can see suburban conformity. You can even see the fear of modern life turning people into interchangeable units. But none of those explanations exhausts the film because there's something more basic underneath them. The pods are frightening because they offer an escape from being a person. And being a person is hard work. You have to love people who might hurt you. You have to deal with grief. You have to tolerate other people's irritating little habits. You have to make choices and sometimes get them wrong. The pod people don't have any of those problems. They found a way of making life simpler. All you have to do is stop being you. By the time Miles and Becky realise just how far the invasion has spread, Invasion of the Body Snatchers has become a remarkably bleak film. They're not fighting an alien army. They're running through a town where almost everybody they meet may already have been replaced. And the really horrible thing is that the replacement don't necessarily want to hurt them. They want them to join in. That gives the film's final stretch an odd quality. There's no great villain standing in a control room waiting to be defeated. The people chasing Miles and Becky are calm, almost sympathetic. From their point of view, they're offering a solution to all the emotional messiness of being human. It's a very different kind of horror from the monster movies that were filling cinemas at the time. But the ending we see wasn't quite the ending the filmmakers originally had in mind. The studio wanted some hope attached to the picture. So the released version begins and ends with a framing story in which Miles is telling his extraordinary story to other doctors. Initially, he's treated as though he's suffered some kind of breakdown, but by the end, the authorities have been given enough reason to take him seriously. It's not exactly cheerful, but it does mean that the film doesn't end with the whole world simply disappearing into the pods. The film itself was meant to be much darker than that framing device suggests. For most of the story, Miles is isolated because nobody believes him. His patients don't believe him. His friends don't believe him. The people around him increasingly don't seem to understand what he's talking about. One of the most memorable things about the film is Kevin McCarthy's performance. He's exhausted, desperate, and hysterical. He's no longer the reassuring small-town doctor we met at the beginning. He's a man who has watched his town disappear, while everybody else insists that nothing has happened. The image of McCarthy running through the streets, desperately trying to stop passing motorists and convince somebody to listen, is probably more memorable than any explanation of the alien invasion. And it gives the film a strangely modern quality. Because the nightmare isn't just being replaced, it's being the only person who knows you've been replaced. The film finishes with a little hope, but by then Don Siegel has already planted the more disturbing idea in your head. What if the pod people are right? What if being human really is all the trouble they say it is? 22 years later, Philip Kaufman would take the same question and put it into a very different America. 22 years is a long time in cinema. When Invasion of the Body Snatchers was released in 1956, America was still very much a post-war country. By the time Philip Kaufman's version appeared in 1978, it had been through Vietnam, Watergate, the social upheavals of the 60s, and the rather weary aftermath of them all. The new film doesn't need to explain any of that. You can feel it. Kaufman moves the story out of the fictional small town of Santa Mira and into San Francisco. That's a pretty significant change in itself. The first film's ordinary little streets and houses made the invasion frightening because it was happening in a place that looked reassuringly familiar. San Francisco is familiar too, but in a completely different way. It's crowded, noisy, and anonymous. People are surrounded by other people without necessarily knowing any of them. The city gives Kaufman far more places to hide a pod, but it also gives him something else, a sense that the characters were already slightly disconnected from the world around them. Donald Sutherland plays Matthew Bennell, a health inspector, and there's another telling change. He's not a small-town doctor with an established place in the community. He's one employee in a large city department, moving through a world of offices, restaurants, and public spaces. And the film looks like it belongs to that world. Michael Chapman's photography gives San Francisco a rather grubby, uneasy beauty. There are deep shadows, strange angles, and crowded streets, but the city never feels quite solid. The film has a slightly dreamlike quality, as though Matthew and his friends are moving through a place they recognise, without ever feeling completely at home in it. Even the opening is different. Instead of beginning with people already worrying about one another, Kaufman begins out in space, with alien spores drifting towards Earth before eventually finding their way into the city. It's a small but significant change. Siegel's film makes the invasion feel as though it has appeared from nowhere, right in the middle of ordinary life. Kaufman shows us that it's coming. We watch it arrive. And then we watch people carry on with their ordinary lives, apparently unaware of what's growing around them. By 1978, the old science fiction idea of an invasion from outer space had become almost secondary. The real unease was much closer to home. And this time, the pods had arrived in a city where a lot of people were already wondering whether they knew their neighbours or themselves quite as well as they thought. Kaufman's film has one enormous advantage over Don Siegel's. By 1978, everyone knew about the pods. The audience already knows what they're looking at. We know what happens when somebody falls asleep. We know what those strange pale things growing beside them are going to do. So Kaufman doesn't have to spend the whole film asking what's going on. Instead, he can make us sit there and wait for the characters to realise it. Sutherland's Matthew Bennell is an excellent centre for that sort of film. He's not a traditional hero. He's slightly scruffy, rather bemused by what's happening around him, and often seems to be reacting to events rather than controlling them. Brooke Adams gives Elizabeth Driscoll a similar quality. She's the first person to become convinced that something is wrong, but her suspicions are difficult to explain without sounding completely mad. That's one of the things Kaufman does particularly well. He lets ordinary conversations become threatening. People talk about someone they know behaving strangely, and the conversation sounds perfectly normal until you remember what the audience already knows. Then there are the supporting performances. Jeff Goldblum is wonderfully eccentric as Jack Belichick, giving the film some nervous energy just when it needs it. Veronica Cartwright's Nancy is more grounded, but she also gives us one of the film's most recognisably human reactions. She is frightened, and she refuses to pretend that she's not. And Leonard Nimoy turns up. There's something almost perversely clever about casting the star of Star Trek as Dr. David Kibner, a successful psychiatrist who has written a book about emotional fulfillment and appears to have an answer for everything. Kibner is exactly the sort of person you might trust. He's calm, he's articulate, he's reassuring. And in a film where reassurance is becoming increasingly sinister, that's rather a good place to put Leonard Nimoy. Kaufman also makes the city itself feel increasingly hostile without turning it into a conventional horror setting. There are crowds, traffic, offices, restaurants, and people everywhere. The characters aren't isolated because they're living in the middle of nowhere. They're isolated because there are too many people around them. And gradually the film starts filling those ordinary places with little signs that something has gone wrong. A strange flower, a pod lying where it shouldn't be, someone behaving just a little too calmly, a person who looks exactly right but somehow doesn't feel right. The 56 film is frightening because it takes an ordinary small town and infects it with something alien. Kaufman's film takes a city that already feels slightly strange and makes us wonder whether the people in it are still human. And when the pods finally start appearing everywhere, the film has already made us nervous about the people before we've seen what the pods can do. That's why the remake doesn't feel like a bigger version of the original. It feels like a different kind of nightmare. There's a perversity to Kaufman's film because the pod people aren't really offering anything very different from the ones in the 1956 film. They still promise an end to all the difficult bits of being human. No arguments, no jealousy, no disappointment, no messy emotions getting in the way. But in 1978, that promise feels rather different. The counterculture had spent the previous decade encouraging people to question authority, reject convention, and find their own way of living. By the time Kaufman's film came along, some of that idealism had given way to exhaustion, cynicism, and a rather more self-conscious interest in the self. And Kaufman turns that world into something horrible. Kibner's books and conversations about personal fulfillment are particularly important here. He talks the language of understanding yourself and finding happiness, but the pod people have taken that idea to its logical extreme. Why struggle to understand yourself at all when you can simply become someone who doesn't have to struggle? There's something almost seductive about them. And that's what makes the 78 film so nasty. The pod people aren't ranting lunatics, they're serene. They don't seem particularly unhappy about losing everything that made them individuals. They've got rid of the difficult stuff. And the film keeps rubbing our noses in that idea. People who have been replaced are suddenly able to recognise one another. They communicate in that strange, quiet way as though they've joined a club whose membership requires you to stop being yourself. It's here that Kaufman's film becomes more than a remake. Siegel's film is frightened by the prospect of a society in which everybody conforms. Kaufman's is frightened by a society in which people have become so detached from one another that conformity might actually seem comforting. And then there's that sound. The pod people have their own horrible cry, a long, unnatural shriek that seems to pass between them like a signal. At this point, the film stops being merely unsettling and becomes genuinely nightmarish. You can hear that somebody has been spotted, and suddenly the whole city seems to be capable of joining in. Finally, Kaufman gives us one of the most famous endings in science fiction cinema. By this point, the characters have spent the film trying to stay awake, trying to escape, and trying to work out who they can trust. But the final horror isn't simply that the pods have taken over. It's that the new world can recognize the remaining humans. They don't have to hunt them down in the dark. They can simply point them out. And when Matthew finally stands among them, looking at what the city has become, the film has turned the original idea inside out. In 1956, the fear was that you might be changed into somebody else. In 1978, the fear is that there might be nowhere left where being yourself is safe. Once you've watched both films, the similarities become almost uncanny. The basic story hasn't really changed. Someone notices that people around them are behaving strangely. The explanation seems impossible. The pods appear, people are replaced. The replacements look exactly like the originals. But the experience of watching the two films is completely different. Siegel's film is remarkably restrained. It starts with a mystery and gradually tightens the screws. Santa Mira becomes frightening precisely because it looks so ordinary. The houses, the streets, the doctor's surgery, none of them look like places where a science fiction story ought to be happening. Kaufman has a much more unsettled visual world to work with. His San Francisco is crowded and grubby, and Michael Chapman's photography makes even familiar places seem slightly unreal. There's a feeling that you're looking at a city that has somehow become unfamiliar without actually changing. And the performances reflect that difference. McCarthy's Spinell becomes increasingly desperate as the film progresses. He is a man trying to hold on to his rationality while the world around him stops making sense. Sutherland's Spinell is different. He's more laid back, more uncertain, and in some ways more modern. He doesn't seem to have the same faith that there is a sensible explanation waiting to be found. Even the people around them are different. In Siegel's film, the threat is largely about people becoming identical. In Kaufman's, the frightening thing is how isolated people already are. That's why I don't think it's particularly useful to ask which film is the better invasion of the Body Snatchers. They're both making use of the same nightmare, but they're dreaming different dreams. The 56 film belongs to a world worried about conformity and the loss of individuality. The 78 film comes from a world that has become less certain that individuality is necessarily going to save us. Neither director needed to invent a new monster. Neither needed a new invasion. They simply took Jack Finney's idea and looked at it from where they happened to be standing. The pods remained the same. The people changed. And that's why, after 22 years, the story still worked. There has been other versions of Invasion of the Body Snatchers since then, but it's those first two that remain particularly fascinating to put side by side. Don Siegel took Jack Finney's idea and made a lean, unsettling little science fiction film in which the familiar world gradually became strange. Kaufman took the same idea 22 years later and found something different in it. His film is bigger, nastier, and more paranoid. But it's also surprisingly funny in places, and much more interested in the strange world of the 70s than in simply repeating what Siegel had already done. This is why neither film really needs to be explained away as an allegory. You can enjoy the 1956 film simply for the atmosphere, those black and white streets, Kevin McCarthy desperately trying to get somebody to listen, Dana Winter beside him, and those pods lying in the darkness. You can enjoy Kaufman's film for completely different reasons. The grubby San Francisco locations, Sutherland looking increasingly bewildered, Goldblum and Nimoy, the strange sound of the pod people calling to one another, and that unforgettable final image. But then you can step back and notice what has happened. We went from the frightening possibility that people around you might surrender their individuality and become part of something larger, to the frightening possibility that people had become so isolated from one another that surrender might actually be comforting. The films don't give us the same nightmare because they weren't made for the same audience. And it's why this story has refused to go away. Every so often, somebody looks at the world around them and thinks that the people they've known all their lives seem somehow different. They're behaving strangely. Something's been lost. And then sooner or later, somebody remembers the pods. That's the wonderful thing about a good science fiction story. You can change the decade, the city, the clothes, the hairstyles, the politics, and the technology. But if you found the right nightmare, you don't have to change very much at all. You just have to put the pods back down and wait for somebody to go to sleep. It's the most disturbing thought of all. Maybe the pods never really went away. Maybe we just keep finding new things to put inside them.